Yeah, so good morning. Yeah, my name's Nicola Swarbrick. I'm the Laboratory Incident Specialist, and we will be using some IT. So let's hope it works. Otherwise, the irony will not be lost on me. So I'm going to use what Jenny and Megan have said, and we're going to look at some cases, some interactive cases. We're going to use a software called Vivox. So if you could get your mobile phone out, that would be much appreciated. You just need to scan the QR code there with your camera, and it should take you directly to the Vivox app. You don't need to download anything. It should be a big white screen with a big blue NHS across the top. If at any point you do lose connection, Vivox will ask you for an ID code, so it's just that 9-digit code, which will be on every slide. So don't worry. If at any point you're bombed out, it's absolutely fine. We can get back in. So yeah, if you give that one a scan with your phone, it's completely anonymous. I've no idea who's answering what, so there will be no naming and shaming. It's just quite nice if people can be interactive. Obviously, it's difficult just sitting there talking to a blank screen. So if you want to get involved, that'd be really great. So the very first one is just to get you used to Vivox. Is where would you like to go on your next holiday? Imagine that there's no queues at bag-in, check-in, and you can go anywhere you like. Where would you like to go? Somewhere expensive, I hope. Oh, lots of responses. Obviously, everyone's got a very long list of places they'd like to go. Super. So let's have a look what everybody had to say. Somebody wants to go to the canteen. Well, I'm with the people off to the Maldives, but some people are obviously very easily pleased, so someone's just off for a bacon butty. So that's as easy as it is anyway. So some of there will be questions in this form, and some will be multiple choice as well. Okay. Oh,
Nikki, do you mind just going back to the QR code? Somebody in the chat's just asking for the QR code again on the first slide.
Yeah, let me just go back. Can you see that one there? If you go to vivox.app, just via Google, it will ask you for an ID code as well. So if you've missed the QR code, it's fine. You can just put that number, and that number appears in the top right-hand corner of every Vivox slide. Okay, so what we're going to talk about, we've already seen from Megan and Jenny about the IT impact on errors in transfusion. We're going to look at some shot reported cases. Hopefully we're going to look at some corrective and preventative actions and learning from those experiences as well. Okay, so the interactive cases, mainly from 2020, like Megan was saying, there were over 1,000 errors reported in the last 4 years, and with nearly 600 near misses. So there's an awful lot where IT was contributed to that error. Okay, so my first case, we've got platelets were issued for patient A, but they were scanned against the wristband for patient B. Okay, so the patient A has got a wristband on, which is a good start, but the wristband is faint. So the nurse decides to reprint it. And on the way back from the printer, she drops the wristband on the floor, but unfortunately picks up someone else's from the floor. She doesn't check the wristband, and she puts it directly onto the patient. She did use an IT system. The tracker did detect the error, and a new wristband was applied, and the unit was transfused safely. So you can see in this one, IT was used correctly, and it did detect the error. So that was a good example of where IT actually picked up an error. On the flip side of that coin, we've got case. I don't know why it's going through it twice. And we've got case 2. So this is a very similar scenario. So we've got patient A, which was actually transfused with red cells intended for patient B. The nurse collected the units correctly, but the bedside tracker lost power during the bedside check-in stage. The nurse didn't follow any downtime procedures and continued to check the unit alone without a second checker. And unfortunately, it wasn't noticed until the shift change, and the next nurse noticed that the patient details on the unit were for somebody else, and the unit was stopped. Thankfully, in this instance, both patients were O positive with no red cell antibodies. So in this case, you can see that there was IT hardware available. It just wasn't used correctly. There was an over-reliance on IT because when that IT had downtime, either the downtime process wasn't followed or it wasn't clear. So then the first VVOX, the real question is, how would you have prevented this in your organisation? So have a little think about what would you have done to prevent this happening in where you work. It should pop up on VVOX. Super. So I'll stop it on that one, only because I'm conscious of the time. So let's have a look what people said for this one. Wow, yeah, excellent. Loads of answers, absolutely all of those things. So more handsets, safety checks, second checker, 2 people check, absolutely perfect answers. So you're absolutely right, all part of a pre-administration safety check. So all of those things would have helped this error not occur in the first place. Okay, so moving on to case 3, we've got the clinical area requests FFP for an actively bleeding neonate, and the baby had no blood group. The BMS selected neonatal FFP from the freezer, but was given a prompt by the LIMS system for a pack number because it was part of a multiple split unit. The BMS didn't understand the alert that popped up and thought it was asking for the donation again, which wouldn't scan because obviously it was a wrong barcode. But the BMS wrongly interpreted that error alert as due to the fact that the unit wasn't an AB. So went back to the freezer, selected an AB unit from the freezer, but unfortunately didn't select FFP, actually selected cryoprecipitate because both of them were stored on the same shelf in the freezer. Because cryo wasn't part of a split pack, it didn't ask for that second pack number, and the unit was issued and transfused. So you can see in this system, the IT was set up correctly. It did alert at the right point, asking for the right donation numbers, but those alerts were either too confusing or they just weren't interpreted correctly. So that in this instance, the LIMS allowed the wrong type of component to be issued. I'll just go back one, sorry. Other things that are related to this, you can see that the FFP and cryo look very similar, don't they? So there was a little bit of cognitive bias there because they do look very similar, and that's the same for adults as well, isn't it? Okay, so this question is, which 2 options would you consider to be the best preventative action? And you can choose up to 2 here. So we've got retraining of the BMS involved, relocation of different components to different shelves in the freezer, update of the LIMS with clearer alerts, or training of staff in cognitive bias. So there are no wrong answers, so just pick whichever 2 you feel would be the best preventative action. Super, lots of people responding, thank you. So yeah, these are quite quick turnarounds because we've got such a short window for the presentation. So let's have a look what everybody thought. Yeah, I don't think there's any wrong answers really here. All of those would have certainly benefited this incident. If we look at this slide, so this talks about the hierarchy of intervention and the effectiveness of making changes. So unfortunately, right down on the bottom are the people-focused interventions, so things like education and training, because effectively what this is trying to show is if you retrain one member of staff, that will only really have an effect on that one member of staff. And as we work up the process, right at the top, the things that make the most difference were the forcing functions. So that was where we use IT to make people make the right choice. So from the previous slide, all of them were useful, but the ones that have the greatest impact were those forcing functions and any automation. Okay, so case 4. 2 OFFP were transfused to a group A patient. And the patient had been part of a major hemorrhage, and the group couldn't be determined because the patient had received lots of O-negs during that time. So the group had been entered as O-neg as a safety to be on the safest side, and a note and a flag had been added to the limbs to say give universal blood component. Unfortunately, later the same day, Group O FFP was issued by the BMS as they thought that anyone could receive O plasma. Alerts did sound on the limb system, but they were overridden and the units were issued and transfused. So this really shows that the limbs was set up correctly, that it did alert to say that there'd been an ABO incompatibility, but going back to what Jenny was saying, some limbs still allow that to be overridden, and that's what happened in this case. And it also shows that there was poor knowledge about that universal blood component, particularly for the plasma. Okay, so the next VVOX question is, what could have helped to prevent this ABOI transfusion? So we've got number 1, update SOP to include ABO compatibilities between groups, create a compatibility chart for both the lab and the clinical area, educate all staff involved for the ABO compatibilities of all components, update the limbs flag with clearer actions, or all of the above. Excellent. It's kind of a trick question, really, isn't it? Yeah. So update all of those things would have helped prevent. You're absolutely right. Whoever answered for number 4, we've just said updating the limbs with clearer functions would be one of those forcing functions, but all of those would certainly have helped prevent this ABOI. Okay. So case 5. A patient requiring irradiated cells, red cells, was transfused with standard units. The limbs did have an irradiation alert, but the patient had 2 separate alerts. And when the BMS came to issue those units, they were distracted and missed that there were 2 distinct alerts, and they were easily overridden. The second checker in the lab they did have, but it was an inexperienced BMS, and they didn't notice the error. And the error wasn't detected at the bedside either, and the unit was transfused. I think this is a really common occurrence, unfortunately, isn't it? So you can see on this one, alerts were overridden, and that leads us to this question. So what percentage of shot reports involve overriding of alerts? So we've got 1%, 3%, 5%, 8%, or 10%. What do you think? Yeah, absolutely. The majority of you there are correct. So if we go into the next slide, I'll show you. So it was effectively alert fatigue. So too many alerts where they're not clear, and that can lead to alert fatigue. So you're exposed to too many alerts leading to desensitization, and that's not necessarily just in the lab at all. I see lots of reports where people have had alert fatigue to do with pumps, that there's so many alerts that they just miss the one that was the important one. So staff then ignore the critical one that's trying to tell you that there's going to be patient harm. And between 2016 and 19, over 10% of all of our reports, bearing in mind we get between 3,500 and 4,000 reports, all of them said that at some point of that error, an alert was overridden. So next question, which of these should be applicable to your limbs alerts? Should they be not easily overridden, clear actions associated with them, relevant to the task, understandable to the limbs users, auditable, or all of the above? Brilliant. 96%. Yeah, it was a kind of a trick question, that one, wasn't it? If you're going to implement limbs alerts, then really we want all of those things. We want them to be not easily overridden. We want them to be clear and relevant to the task, and understandable to the person that's actually reading them. And where possible, we would like them to be auditable. And then you can see where those alerts are appearing. Oh, okay, so case 6. Was a post stem cell transplant patient transferred from another hospital, and the laboratory were not informed of the transplant status. In the lab, the grouping results were discrepant, so the lab contacted the ward and the ward informed them that the patient had had a bone marrow transplant, and the BMS updated the notepad section but did not add any LIMS alerts, and they didn't update the LIMS from donor to recipient group either, and unfortunately that meant that the patient received incorrect D components. And so here you can see there was poor communication. This is a really common theme, unfortunately. Poor communication from between hospitals and between the hospital ward and the laboratory area as well. There was use of IT, but it wasn't really used appropriately, really, was it? Adding it to the notepad it relies on somebody going to visit that X section in the LIMS system as well. So the next question is, does your organisation have a clear process for informing the laboratory of a specific requirement? So our options are yes, a paper form notification, so maybe something you print off your local IT system. Yes, electronic notification. Yes, added to the request form. No, you haven't got a clear process, or you're unsure. Yeah, so quite a variety there, isn't there? Having that clear lines of communication would really benefit the lab and the clinical area, which will ultimately obviously benefit the patient, because we're going to make sure that they receive all their specific requirements. Looking back over the last 4 or 5 years, communication failures between either shared care between 2 hospitals or between the clinical area and the lab area were stated as a contributory factor in nearly 40% of our special requirements not met, which is a huge amount. And 10% of them were in paediatric patients as well. So the line there, it's just really reiterates the importance of good lines of communication between all areas involved with patient care. There is a transfusion practice transfusion checklist on the SHOT website. If you've not, you might have your own local process as well, but that is available on the SHOT website for you to view as well. So our last case is a sickle cell patient requiring a red cell transfusion. The units issued did not meet specific requirements, so they weren't RH and K matched, they weren't HBS neg, and they weren't fresh units either. A LIMS alert had been added, but it had been added at a level that only one BMS could view it, so it was at the Transfusion Lab Manager level, so nobody else could see that. So unfortunately, when the BMS and the lab came to issue units, standard red cells were issued. Luckily, in this instance, or thankfully, the patient did not develop any red cell antibodies, but that would have made obviously it much more difficult to provide units for the patient in the future. So you can see IT was used. It just wasn't used correctly. So there were 236 special requirement cases where units were issued that did not meet a patient's requirement in 2020, and they were mainly due to poor communication, the patient record not being kept up to date, consent, the patient wasn't asked the right questions, it wasn't noted on the request form, the LIMS, the right alerts weren't added, and administration checks weren't completed appropriately. So the last question is, so in the last decade, how many hemoglobinopathy patients received red cells that did not meet their specific requirements? So we've got here from 0 to 150. So how many do you think didn't meet? You can just put a number. It should ask you for a number. It's just a guess, really. Have a little guess. Wow. Yeah, a massive spread there. The actual answer was 127. So right over on the right hand side, a massive shift. So it's an awful lot of patients not meeting their specific requirements, and that was just for one patient group as well. So SHOT, in the last couple of weeks, they've produced a safety notice to do with specific requirements. That's all available on the SHOT website. And there's a really helpful gap analysis tool as well for both the clinical and the laboratory area that you can identify where your practice is and where you would like to move towards. Okay, so lessons learned. IT can be helpful. but it must be set up correctly and used appropriately. IT can introduce new errors both in the clinical area and the laboratory area for such things like influencing factors like alert fatigue and cognitive bias, and certainly over-reliance on that IT. So the LIMS systems in the lab must be set up appropriately, so configured with the right algorithms and the alerts, and upgraded to maximise the potential of that system. Alerts must be understandable and actionable, not easily overridden, and making sure that the person who's reading that alert understands what the action you want, what does it want me to do. Like Jenny and Megan were talking, that interoperability between systems to maximise the transfer of information and minimise the manual input of information, and having a robust and tested contingency downtime to minimise errors. There's an awful lot of resources on the SHOT website. We have things called SHOT Bites, which are like a couple of A4 sheets summarising lots of information with good references and resources. We've got webinars and videos and email signatures as well. We've also got the SHOT app, which you can download onto your phone. And we've got our SHOT Symposium in just a few weeks down in Brighton. So we'd really like people to come and attend and be part of our transfusion community. And that's us. So the door is always open. You can tweet us, you can email us, and you can come and visit the website. If there's something that you particularly want or you need, do get in touch with the team and we'll be more than happy to help.